It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Stephen Brammer, Dean at the University of Bath School of Management. Stephen's paper was recently published in Human Resources Management. The paper title is Factors Shaping the Employment Outcomes of Neurodivergent and Neurotypical People, Exploring the Role of Flexible and Home Working Practices. Stephen's co-authors were Layla Branicki, an associate professor at the University of Bath School of Management, Mark Brosnan, a professor of psychology and head of department for psychology at the University of Bath, Aida Garcia Lazaro, an economist and researcher at the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath, Susan Lattanzio, the Research and Industry Engagement Manager and Deputy Director for the Made Smarter Innovation, Center for People-Led Digitalization, and Linda Newnes, a professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Bath. Welcome to the interview with me, with HRM.
Welcome, it's a real pleasure to be here.
I have several questions for you, and the first one is, why is your study important? What is the problem that led you to research this?
Well, firstly, thank you for the opportunity to share that. It's really valuable to be able to do that. And part of the origin story of this paper comes from the long list of wonderful colleagues that you've just described, Jelena. The origin of the project is very much in the Centre for People-Led Digitalization and Linda and Susan's work in collaboration with Mark Brosnan. Mark runs a centre called the Centre for Applied Autism Research at the centre, and he's a leading autism researcher. Part of the work that had been going on in the Centre for People-Led Digitalization had, as a kind of side consequence, as they were looking at digitalization of firms and industries, had noticed the poor employment experience and the challenges that employers were facing in providing opportunities for neurodivergent people. And that got us and some students who did some fantastic work in the centre thinking about how we might explore what it took to make workplaces neurodivergence inclusive, which was ultimately the object. But the problem at the heart of it then is that we know anecdotally that neurodivergent people, so that might be people with conditions on the autism spectrum, or it might be Asperger's, or it might be ADHD, or a whole range of other conditions. We know anecdotally that they find finding fulfilling, sustained, paid employment challenging, but we don't really know a lot in quantitative terms about the scale of the challenge, or in particular about what organisations can do to make employment of neurodivergent people more satisfying. And just to set that in context, in our study, if you look at the youngest age group of employees, about 5% of those employees have neurodivergence of one form or another. What that suggests is, the average in our sample is 1.5%. What that suggests is that the proportion of employees with some form of neurodivergence is going to at least treble in the next 15 or 20 years. And that, I think, is a very conservative estimate. So fundamentally, this is a really important moral challenge for people who, that we owe obligations to and we should be supporting. And it's the responsible thing to want to support their employment. But it's also a fundamental economic challenge in a skills-constrained economy. What are organisations doing to make sure that they are as receptive and accommodating of talent as they can possibly be? This is a growing proportion of the workforce, and I think it would be, from a simple instrumental perspective, poor practice of employers not to want to be neurodivergent inclusive.
So what did you find?
Well, firstly, we were able to find and corroborate and parameterize some really important adverse employment impacts among neurodivergent people. So, for example, in our sample, we found that neurodivergent individuals are more than twice as likely to be in precarious employment, so to have volatile hours, uncertain hours, more than 10 times as likely as neurotypical people to be in permanent work. We also found that neurodivergent people are significantly more likely to be underemployed, so not to have as many hours of work in a given week as they might like, and that their employment tenures were significantly shorter, which sort of suggests that they go from job to job rather than having sustained employment over time. So the first part of the study really demonstrates in really concrete terms something that I think we'd long suspected, which is there are really substantial adverse employment impacts among the neurodivergent community compared with neurotypical workers. The second thing we do in the study, because the immediate question that begs is, well, what can we do about it? How can organizations create environments that are more inclusive to neurodivergent employees? And a lot of that work focuses on specific accommodations. So, for example, adaptations to work environments, training programs or support programs that enable, for example, autistic workers to thrive in the context of workplaces. Our interest was in exploring the relevance of relatively widespread HR practice. So rather than saying, for each individual, how do we create a package of accommodations around them that enables them to succeed? We asked the question, what about home working and flexible work practices that we're seeing a lot of now in contemporary workplaces? To what extent do those, let's be honest, fairly basic and diffuse practices offer opportunities for enhanced employment outcomes for neurodivergent people? And we found that both flexible work practices, but particularly home working practices, really overturn much of the disadvantage that you see in general among neurodivergent employees. So, for example, where home working is available to employees, underemployment disappears. It's much more likely that neurodivergent people can sustain longer employment tenures where those practices are available. So in a nutshell, what we do is we show on the one hand that neurodivergent people experience really a lot of employment disadvantage in multifaceted ways. Secondly, that really quite basic things such as home working and flexible working, which we're all seeing a lot more of in our employment lives, can really very substantially contribute as solutions to that problem.
That sounds great and really important, as you said. So I have a couple of more questions here, and one is, why does that matter theoretically? And the other will be practical implications, which you already spoken a bit about, but still I will be asking again. So
good.
Theoretically,
always happy to talk more. So the theoretical importance, I think, speaks to how we think of and how we conceptualize neurodivergence. And I think we in the paper, in common with a lot of prior research on neurodivergence, really conceptualize neurodivergence as a specific disability. And we say, rather as lots of the prior literature does, it says, well, neurodivergence is a disability in the sense that it leads to impairment of an individual's capacity to do the things one might normally expect them to do in an enduring way. That literature focuses very much on accommodations, and there are issues of disclosure and seeking and whose responsibility it is to seek accommodations. And really it centers on a problematization of the person. The reason that somebody is not, have a longer employment tenure or isn't employed more or so on is because of the disability that the individual has. We believe very much in a shift from a problematization of the person to a problematization of the workplace. And we say instead, and we think this is, we'd like to see a move away from conceptualization of neurodivergence as disability towards neurodivergence as an opportunity for workplaces to demonstrate their inclusiveness and to find ways to support people. So we see non-neurodivergence inclusion as a problem of the workplace rather than a problem of the individuals. And I think that's really, we were struck as we did the research of the limitations of thinking of neurodivergence through a disability frame. Most, I conjecture most, certainly many in my experience, neurodivergent people do not construe themselves as disabled in the same way perhaps as somebody with another disability might be. So disability framings are somewhat offensive, I think, to that population, but also they call, rather than asking organizations to create conditions where all employees can be successful and where all employees can thrive, they particularize and problematize individuals for what they can't do rather than for showcasing what they can do. So I think there's something really important in HRM research, but more broadly on research on neurodivergence, to move away from a disability framing and to create new conceptualizations of neurodivergence that look at the opportunities that are inherent in a really diverse group of individuals.
So now I know you already mentioned some of the implications for practice, but if you don't mind just summarizing at least what your results mean for HR policy or the practice of HR.
So I guess that what's the really good news in our study? What our study shows is that many of the fundamental employment disadvantages of neurodivergent people can be very, very substantially mitigated by really quite generalized and simple organizational policy intervention. So we've all seen in the post-pandemic environment more flexible working, more home working, but also I think a lot more attention to different kinds of flexible working. You know, is this about flexi term time hours, for example, where you work around schools and university timetables and so on in terms of creating flexibility? Is it about annualized hours? Is it straightforward, good old-fashioned flexi working? All of these things, which are increasingly available to colleagues throughout, in many types of job and work environment, hold the real potential for being more inclusive for neurodivergent people, and yet they aren't available everywhere. So one of the key things I think we would see some great merit in is an extension of flexible and home working where that's appropriate and where that's possible. We see that as something that is beneficial for employees, but also beneficial for organizations. So what the broader question, I think, is, and this is a research agenda for us ultimately, is how policies and practices that are not specifically targeted exclusively or even at all towards neurodivergent people, how they deliver nonetheless benefits by conferring for those individuals with the capacity to have greater agency in their working life. And I think, part of the generalized lesson of our study is that if you can put agency in the hands of employees, then that can be a significant part of what being a more inclusive workplace for colleagues with a range of different abilities and disabilities.
Thank you. I do not have any more questions, and I can just say that it's been a pleasure. It was a pleasure to meet you, Steve, and I would like to thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to share our research.